A lamp shatters. Sayla scrambles away, clutching her silk dress to her chest in terror. Sayla, wait. Tae-Ho reaches out, his voice cracking, but she screams, "You're a freak. A monster," and bolts. Left in the suffocating silence, the cold king collapses. Tears of pure confusion track down his face. He is broken by a strength he can't control. The transition from the penthouse to the city's jagged skyline is a blur of neon and rain. While Tae-Ho sits in the dark, staring at his shaking hands and wondering why his touch feels like an assault to the women he tries to love, the world outside keeps turning. In a gravel-strewn alley, Janice Holloway is living a different kind of nightmare. Surrounded by 3 armed thugs, she doesn't weep or tremble. She breathes through the tension, her voluminous natural curls damp with rain, her mahogany skin glowing under the flickering street lamps. With a sudden, explosive grace, she disarms the lead attacker, her face a mask of cold, calculated survival. Watching from a black sedan, Junho sees the answer to his boss's prayers. He calls Tae-Ho, who answers with a voice cracked and hollow from his recent breakdown. "Boss," Junho says firmly, "stop looking for a porcelain doll. They break too easily, and they leave you blaming yourself for being too much. You need a survivor who isn't afraid of the dark because she was forged in it." I found her. The next morning, Janice walks through the cold and structured Mafia headquarters. Her vibrant animal print jacket is a defiant splash of color against the gray stone. She pushes into Tae-Ho's office, finding him masked in discipline, though his eyes remain haunted. She leans over his desk, looking directly into his soul. "I heard you think you're a monster," she whispers. "I've fought real monsters, Tae-Ho. You just look like a man who's been lonely too long. Are we working, or are you still mourning?" The cold king has finally met his match, but the descent into Seoul's underworld is just beginning. Will Janice Holloway break under the pressure of the monster, or will she be the only one to survive his storm? Don't miss a single high-stakes heartbeat. Subscribe to follow the visual narrative of the Kwon Empire and witness every warm and bold disruption. Like this story if you believe being too much is exactly what the world needs. Comment "Survivor" if you're ready to see Janice handle the secrets that would kill anyone else. The contract is signed. The night is young. Click the notification bell to stay locked into the most dangerous romance of 2026. The ironclad silence of the Kwon conglomerate was more than just professional. It was a physical weight, a cold and structured vacuum where the only sound was the synchronized hum of high-end servers and the rhythmic, hollow clicks of subordinates moving like ghosts. The lobby was a temple of white marble and obsidian glass, designed to make anyone entering feel small, fragile, and utterly replaceable. The air smelled of expensive ozone and filtered neutrality, until the heavy glass doors swung open with a force that defied the building's silent protocol. Janice Holloway didn't just walk into the room. She disrupted its very molecular structure. Her boots, heavy and unapologetic, struck the polished floor with a sound that echoed like a heartbeat in a morgue. She was a warm and bold explosion in a monochrome world. Her mahogany skin radiated a healthy, sun-kissed glow that made the fair-complexioned receptionists look like statues carved from ice. Her hair, a voluminous, perfectly defined afro, framed her face like a crown of natural silk, refusing to be tamed by the sleek, flat aesthetics of the corporate elite. As she moved toward the security desk, her animal print jacket caught the sterile overhead lighting, the bold patterns acting as a visual middle finger to the sea of gray suits. She didn't bow. She didn't offer a polite, practiced smile. Instead, she adjusted the strap of her bag and looked the head of security directly in the eye, her soft, almond-shaped eyes filled with a terrifyingly calm focus. "Janice Holloway," she said, her voice a rich, low contralto that seemed to vibrate the very air. "I believe Director Kwon is expecting a survivor." The guards hesitated, their hands hovering near their holsters, unsettled by a woman who looked at their weapons as if they were toys. They were used to high society debutantes who smelled of lilies and trembled at the sight of a frown. Janice smelled of sandalwood and rain, and she stood with an hourglass silhouette that suggested a regal strength rather than delicate grace. She didn't wait for them to process her clearance. Before the lead guard could reach for his radio, Janice was already moving toward the private elevator reserved for the Cold King. She bypassed the velvet ropes with a fluid, athletic step that spoke of a life lived on the edge, where hesitation meant defeat. As the elevator doors hissed shut, she caught her reflection in the smoked mirror. She wasn't a ghost, and she wasn't a freak. She was the fire coming to burn through the ice of the 50th floor. Above her, the floor indicator climbed toward the penthouse, where a man sat in the dark, waiting for a monster and unaware that he was about to meet his match. The elevator doors hissed open to a floor that felt more like a pressurized vault than a corporate suite. The air was colder here, tasting of expensive filtration and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. Janice stepped out, her animal print coat a sudden, vibrant invasion against the slate-gray walls. She didn't have to look for the office. The muffled sound of a struggle and the heavy, rhythmic thud of a body hitting a desk guided her toward the double mahogany doors at the end of the hall. She pushed them open without a knock. Inside, the cold and structured sanctuary of Kwon Tae-Ho was in disarray. A man in a shredded suit was pinned against the glass windows, his face a map of crimson streaks, while Junho held him by the throat with one hand, a jagged piece of a broken crystal carafe in the other. Tae-Ho stood behind his desk, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. His jaw was a razor edge of fury, his eyes still shimmering with that haunting, desperate intensity that had sent Seoul screaming into the night. Blood had spattered across the pristine white rug, a jagged Rorschach test of violence. Junho glanced at the door, his grip tightening, expecting another screaming socialite or a panicked secretary. Instead, he saw Janice. She didn't scream. She didn't faint. She didn't even break her stride. Janice walked toward the center of the room, her eyes sweeping over the bleeding captive with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen much worse in a Saturday night alleyway. She stopped just inches from the blood-soaked rug, looked down at her polished boots, and then up at Tae-Ho. "You're getting iron stains on a silk blend carpet, director," she said, her voice a low, steady mahogany hum that cut through the adrenaline-thick air. "That's going to be a nightmare to get out if you let it dry." Tae-Ho froze. He watched her as she reached into her bag, pulled out a pair of latex gloves, and snapped them on with a crisp, professional sound. She walked over to the side table, picked up a fresh bottle of mineral water and a clean linen cloth, and approached the captive. Junho looked to Tae-Ho for a signal. The boss only nodded, his chest heaving with a confusion that was rapidly turning into a stunned, magnetic fascination. Janice grabbed the captive's chin, tilting his head back to inspect the wound. "Deep, but not lethal," she shrugged, dabbing at the blood as if she were cleaning a spilled drink. "Junho, let him go. He's already told you what you need to know. He's just leaking on the furniture now to spite you." She finished her work, tossed the bloody cloth into a wastebasket, and peeled off the gloves. Turning to Tae-Ho, she caught him staring at her, not as a monster stares at prey, but as a man stares at a miracle. For the first time in his life, his intensity hadn't caused a flight response. "I'm Janice," she said, smoothing her animal print lapel. "I assume the coffee in this office is better than the security. Fix your tie, Tae-Ho. We have work to do." The air inside the grand crystal ballroom was thick with the scent of lilies and cold, calculated betrayal. For any other woman, the gala gambit would have been a death sentence. A high-stakes masquerade where one wrong look could trigger a silent war between Seoul's most dangerous factions. But as the heavy gilded doors swung open, it wasn't fear that radiated from the woman on Kwon Tae-Ho's arm. It was a warm and bold defiance that set the room's temperature rising. Janice Holloway was a masterpiece of strategic elegance. She had traded her animal print jacket for a floor-length gown of liquid bronze that clung to her hourglass silhouette, the metallic fabric glowing against her deep mahogany skin. Her natural curls were swept up, adorned with gold pins that caught the light like scattered stars. Beside her, Tae-Ho was the definition of cold and structured perfection, his black tuxedo tailored to a razor's edge, His jet-black hair swept back with lethal precision. "Stay close," Tae-Ho murmured, his voice a low, jagged vibration near her ear. His hand was splayed across the small of her back, the heat of his palm seeping through the thin silk of her gown. It was supposed to be a protective gesture, a performance for the rival cartel leaders watching from the balconies, but the way his fingers tightened, possessive and rhythmic, felt dangerously unscripted. They moved through the crowd like a single, predatory organism. When they reached the center of the floor, the music shifted into a slow, haunting waltz. Tae-Ho pulled her in, his structured jaw tightening as their bodies collided. This wasn't the tentative touch of his previous 10 failures. This was an anchored collision. For the first time, he wasn't holding back, and Janice wasn't breaking. "You're shaking," Janice whispered, her almond-shaped eyes locking onto his intense, shimmering gaze. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his broad chest, her hand sliding up the crisp lapel of his suit to rest against the pulse point at his neck. His heart was hammering a frantic, wild rhythm that contradicted his composed expression. "I've never had to act this hard," Tae-Ho grunted, his breath hitching as her scent, sandalwood and heat, overwhelmed the room's floral perfume. "Then stop acting," she challenged, her neutral-toned lips inches from his. The gala gambit was meant to fool their enemies, but as Tae-Ho spun her under the chandelier's fire, the pretense vanished. The rival bosses, the hidden weapons, and the high-stakes deal faded into the background. There was only the cold king, finally finding a friction that didn't burn him, and the survivor, realizing that for the first time in her life, she didn't want to be anywhere else. The acting had become a secondary skin, and beneath it, a raw, terrifying reality was taking root. They weren't posing as a couple. They were becoming one. The bronze silk of Janice's gown was still cool against her skin when the first window shattered. The sound wasn't the clean break of a gala glass, but the percussive, high-velocity crack of a suppressed sniper round. Before the shards could hit the floor, Tae-Ho's cold and structured discipline took over. He didn't shout, he moved. In one fluid, athletic motion, he surged forward, his arms sweeping Janice off her feet and slamming them both behind the heavy mahogany desk as a second round whistled through the space where her head had been a second before. The penthouse, usually a silent temple of marble and glass, was suddenly a kill zone. Tae-Ho's breathing was a jagged, rhythmic rasp in the dark. He was pressed against her, his broad shoulders shielding her curvaceous frame, his heart hammering against her back like a trapped bird. "Jun-Ho is sweeping the perimeter," he hissed, his jaw tight against her temple. "The elevators are locked down. The stairwell is compromised. You need to get to the panic room. Now." He tried to push her toward the concealed door behind the bookshelves, his movements frantic with a protective desperation that bordered on panic. He was waiting for it, the wide-eyed terror, the sobbing, the monster accusation that always followed the violence of his world. But Janice didn't move. She stayed anchored in the shadows, her mahogany skin glowing in the amber light of the security hut. She reached out, her hand sliding over his trembling fingers, pinning his hand to the floor. "I'm not going into a box, Tae-Ho," she whispered, her voice a warm, steady mahogany hum that acted like a sedative to his skyrocketing adrenaline. "And I'm not leaving you out here to play martyr." "You don't understand," he rasped, his eyes shimmering with that raw, soul-crushing confusion. "They're here for me. If you stay, you're a target. I can't. I can't be the reason you break." Janice leaned in, her forehead resting against his. The scent of sandalwood and gunpowder swirled between them, an intoxicating, high-stakes perfume. "Look at me, director. Do I look broken to you?" She didn't flinch as another round thudded into the desk above them. Instead, she tightened her grip on his hand. "You've spent your whole life thinking you're too much. Tonight, you're exactly enough. Now, give me the backup piece in your ankle holster and tell me the structural weak points of that door. We're finishing this night together." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the cold isolation of his past, but a shared, electric heartbeat. Tae-Ho looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, the cold king didn't feel like a monster. He felt like a man who had finally found a wall he couldn't knock down. As the night stretched on in the pressurized silence of the penthouse, the close quarters became a crucible, melting the professional contract until only the raw, terrifying heat of two survivors remained. The adrenaline of the firefight had settled into a heavy, electric silence that pressed against the walls of the penthouse. The threat had been neutralized by Junho's team, leaving only the cold king and the survivor in the amber glow of the emergency lights. Tae-Ho stood by the shattered window, his crisp white shirt torn and stained with the grit of the evening, his broad shoulders heaving with a rhythmic, jagged breath. He looked like a fallen god, his jet-black hair falling over his forehead in a rare display of disorder. "You should go to the guest suite, Janice," he rasped, his voice a low, warning vibration. He didn't turn to face her, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the mahogany desk. "The danger is over, but the monster is still in this room." Janice didn't move toward the door. She moved toward him. Her bronze gown shimmered like liquid fire in the dim light, her mahogany skin glowing with a heat that defied the sterile air. "I've told you before, Tae-Ho, I don't scare, and I don't run from shadows." He turned then, his eyes shimmering with that raw, soul-crushing confusion. "You don't understand. Every woman who has ever been here, they flee. They call me a freak. My intensity, it's a storm that breaks everything it touches. I am too much, Janice. I am too much for anyone to handle." He reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered near her face, a desperate, silent plea for her to leave before he could disappoint her. But Janice didn't flinch. She stepped into his space, her curvaceous frame anchoring against his lean, athletic physique. She took his shaking hand and pressed it firmly against her cheek, her soft almond-shaped eyes locking onto his. "Then be too much," she whispered, her voice a warm, steady anchor. "Because I've spent my whole life being told I was too bold and too loud. Stop apologizing for your fire, Tae-Ho. I'm the only one who knows how to dance in it." The collision was instantaneous and transformative. When his lips finally met hers, it wasn't the tentative touch of a man afraid of his own strength. It was the release of a lifetime of suppressed hunger. The cold and structured barriers he had built around his heart didn't just crack, they vaporized. In the high-stakes silence of the penthouse, the monster vanished, replaced by a man who finally found a friction that didn't burn, but forged something new. As they moved together, the night became a crucible of warm and bold energy meeting cold and structured power. Every touch was a revelation, every breath a shared defiance against the world that had labeled them outcasts. Tae-Ho realized, with a clarity that brought tears to his eyes, that he wasn't a freak. He was simply a king who had finally found a queen strong enough to wear the crown. In that one explosive night, Janice didn't just handle him. She claimed him, proving that the only thing too much about Kwon Tae-Ho was how long he had waited to be truly seen. The sun rose over Seoul in a wash of pale, clinical gray, bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse. The cold and structured reality of Kwon Tae-Ho's world had returned with the daylight, but the man himself felt fundamentally altered. He lay in the center of the silk sheets, his athletic frame finally at rest, watching the way the dawn light caught the deep mahogany glow of Janice's shoulder. For the first time in his life, the silence wasn't a tomb, it was a sanctuary. Then, Janice moved. She didn't wake with a soft sigh or a lingering touch. She sat up with a sudden, coordinated grace, her voluminous curls casting a shadow over her face. Before Tae-Ho could speak, before he could offer the raw, terrifying vulnerability that had been building in his chest, Janice was already out of the bed. She gathered her bronze gown from the floor, her expression a mask of warm and bold defiance that had turned suddenly, chillingly professional. "That was exactly what I needed," she said, her voice a flat, mahogany hum that lacked any of the heat from the night before. She didn't look at him. She reached for her animal print jacket, snapping it on like armor. A hell of a way to blow off the stress of an assassination attempt, Director. "I'll be at the office by 9. Tae-Ho felt the air leave his lungs as if he'd been struck. He sat up, his jet-black hair messy, his eyes shimmering with a sudden, sharp confusion. Stress relief? He repeated, the words tasting like ash. Janice, look at me. That wasn't just. It was a professional courtesy, she interrupted, finally meeting his gaze with eyes that were focused and distant. She was building a wall, brick by reinforced brick, terrified that if she let him see how much he had moved her, she would lose the survivor edge that kept her alive. We're partners, Tae-Ho. We had a high adrenaline night. It happens. Don't make it weird. She turned and walked toward the elevator, her boots striking the marble with that same unapologetic rhythm she'd arrived with. The doors hissed shut, leaving Tae-Ho in a room that suddenly felt too large and far too cold. But as the silence settled, the cold king didn't collapse into the old despair. His jaw tightened, his structured profile regaining its disciplined intensity. He recognized a defensive maneuver when he saw one. Janice Holloway thought she could run back to the streets and hide behind a lie, but she had underestimated the man she had just handled. Tae-Ho stood, walking to the window to watch her tiny figure emerge onto the street below. He wasn't the monster she had to fear anymore. He was the hunter. He had spent his life getting what he wanted through power and fear, but for Janice, he would use something far more lethal, persistence. The hunt to keep her had begun, and this time, he wouldn't stop until she admitted that the stress relief was the only truth they had left. The air in the cold and structured war room of the Kwon headquarters was brittle, vibrating with the silent tension of a deal that was supposed to be final. Tae-Ho sat at the head of the obsidian table, his fair complexion pale against the dark suit, his eyes tracking the digital ledgers with a meticulous, disciplined focus. Junho stood at his shoulder, a silent sentinel who believed he had cleared every corner and vetted every guard. They were prepared for a frontal assault, but they were blind to the rot spreading beneath the floorboards. Janice didn't enter through the main elevator. She arrived like a warm and bold shadow, her animal print jacket damp with the grit of the lower districts, her mahogany skin glowing with the sweat of a woman who had been running through the city's veins. She didn't wait for the briefing to end. She slammed a burner phone onto the obsidian table, the screen flickering with a grainy, intercepted transmission from a street-level informant. The docks are a distraction, Tae-Ho, she said, her voice a low, urgent mahogany hum that stopped the room's heartbeat. Your inner circle didn't catch it because they don't listen to the ghosts on the corner. The betrayal isn't coming from the rival cartel. It's coming from the logistics team you've trusted for a decade. Junho stepped forward, his structured jaw tightening in disbelief. My men cleared the logistics manifests this morning, Janice. There's nothing. Your men look for paper trails, Janice interrupted, her soft almond-shaped eyes flashing with a regal authority. I look for whispers. The longshoremen in Abakaliki are talking. The drivers are being paid in untraceable crypto. While you're watching the front door, your loyal lieutenants are prepping a kill switch for the entire supply chain. Tae-Ho looked from the phone to Janice, his intense gaze shimmering with a mixture of shock and a deepening, magnetic respect. He realized then that Janice wasn't just a PA or a distraction. She was a shadow asset he hadn't known he needed. She had reached into the dark places his power couldn't touch and pulled out the truth. Pull the shipment, Tae-Ho commanded, his voice regaining its lethal, disciplined edge. He didn't look at the monitors. He looked only at Janice. The cold king saw the survivor standing before him, her natural curls wild from the wind, her presence a bold, unbreakable anchor in a world of shifting loyalties. Junho moved to execute the orders, realizing for the first time that his boss's safety didn't just depend on guns and gates. It depended on the woman who refused to let Tae-Ho be blindsided. Janice had saved his empire not with a weapon, but with the very street smarts he had once questioned. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Tae-Ho stood and walked toward her, the hunt for her heart momentarily eclipsed by the realization that she was the only person in the world who truly had his back. The grand ballroom was a sea of cold and structured elegance, a high-stakes arena where reputations were assassinated more often than men. Selah Montgomery stood at the center of a clique of ivory-skinned socialites, her silk gown a pale, shimmering armor. She had been waiting for this moment since the night she fled the penthouse in a half-dressed panic. When Janice entered, her mahogany skin glowing against a bold, emerald-patterned dress that hugged her hourglass curves, the room's temperature seemed to drop. Selah didn't wait. She intercepted Janice near the champagne tower, her voice a sharp, practiced needle designed to draw blood in front of the Underworld's elite. "It's fascinating, isn't it?" Selah remarked, loud enough to draw a crowd of silent, judgmental observers. Tae-Ho's standards have shifted, from legacy families to street-level assistants who probably still have the scent of the slums on their skin. "Tell us, Janice, does he pay you in cash, or does he just let you keep the jewelry you find in the couch cushions?" A ripple of cruel, quiet laughter moved through the circle. Tae-Ho, standing a few paces away with Junho, felt the familiar, violent intensity rise in his chest, his jaw tightening into a razor-edged mask of fury. He moved to intervene, to crush the insult with the weight of his authority, but Janice caught his eye. A small, warm and bold shake of her natural curls stopped him in his tracks. Janice didn't flinch. She didn't reach for a glass to throw or a slap to deliver. Instead, she stepped into Selah's personal space, her presence so regal and unfazed that Selah's smirk began to falter. Janice leaned in, her voice a low, mahogany hum that was intended only for Selah's ears, though the entire room felt the weight of it. "You're making a scene because you're terrified, Selah," Janice whispered, her soft almond eyes locked onto the other woman's shaking hands. "You ran because you couldn't handle the heat of a real man, and now you're trying to burn me to feel warm again. But here's the street truth. I know exactly what you whispered to the rival families last Tuesday to try and save your own skin. I have the recordings, the names, and the price you set on Tae-Ho's head." The color drained from Selah's face, leaving her fair complexion a ghostly, sickly white. She tried to speak, to deny the betrayal, but the words died in her throat as Janice's gaze turned clinical. "I'm not a debutante you can bully at a party," Janice continued, smoothing a stray thread on Selah's shoulder with a terrifyingly calm focus. "I'm the woman who cleans up the messes people like you leave behind. Walk away, go find a man as shallow as you are, and pray I never have a reason to tell the director what I found in the shadows." Selah didn't say another word. She turned and fled the gala for the second time, her heels clicking a desperate, hollow rhythm against the marble. Janice turned back to the room, picked up a flute of champagne, and caught Tae-Ho's stunned, magnetic stare. She had humbled the elite not with a weapon, but with the cold, hard currency of truth. The survivor had just claimed the ballroom, and the cold king realized he was no longer looking at a PA. He was looking at the only woman capable of ruling by his side. The morning light that flooded the penthouse was no longer clinical or gray. It was a warm, liquid gold that seemed to settle into the very marrow of the mahogany furniture. Kwon Tae-Ho stood by the repaired floor-to-ceiling glass, his structured profile silhouetted against the awakening city. He was dressed in a black suit of lethal, disciplined precision, but his shoulders were loose, the old, rigid tension replaced by a grounded, magnetic power. Janice was at the breakfast bar, her natural curls caught in the sunlight, her mahogany skin glowing as she reviewed the morning's intelligence reports. She was wearing one of his white shirts, the oversized silk draping over her curvaceous frame, a bold, intimate disruption of his monochrome sanctuary. She didn't look like a PA anymore. She looked like the heartbeat of the building. "Junho has the logistics teams in holding," she said, her voice a low, steady mahogany hum. "The betrayal has been purged. The streets are quiet, Tae-Ho. They're waiting to see what the Cold King does next." Tae-Ho didn't answer with a report or a command. He walked toward her, his rhythmic, athletic stride bringing him into her personal space. He didn't tower over her to intimidate. He leaned in, his fair complexion flushed with a raw, visible emotion that no longer terrified him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, heavy vellum envelope. It wasn't a bank transfer or a non-disclosure agreement. I'm terminating your employment, Janice, he whispered, his voice a jagged, intense vibration. Janice stilled, her soft almond eyes narrowing in a flash of warm and bold defiance. You think you can just fire me after I saved your empire? After. I'm terminating the position of assistant, he interrupted, his hand sliding up to cup her jaw, his thumb tracing the line of her high cheekbones. I don't need someone to handle my secrets. I need someone to own them with me. I spent my life thinking I was a monster because I hadn't found a woman who could stand in the center of my storm without breaking. You didn't just stand there, Janice. You took the lightning and threw it back. He placed the envelope on the counter. Inside was a deed, a partnership agreement, and a ring of black diamonds that looked like frozen smoke. This is a new contract. No expiration date. No exit clause. I'm offering you half of everything I am and everything I own. Not as a shadow asset, but as an equal. A life for a life. Janice looked at the contract, then back at the man who had once collapsed in tears of confusion. The cold king was gone, replaced by a partner who finally saw his own strength as a virtue. She didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. She reached out, her hand locking with his, the survivor meeting the monster in the middle of the wreckage they had survived together. You're still a lot to handle, Tae-Ho, she purred, her neutral-toned lips curving into a regal, dangerous smile. But lucky for you, I've always liked a challenge. They stood together against the glass, two outcasts who had built a throne out of their scars. The old world was gone. A new empire had begun. The high-rise windows of the penthouse no longer felt like the walls of a transparent cage. As the sun dipped below the Seoul skyline, painting the cold and structured marble in shades of bruised purple and gold, the silence was no longer heavy with the weight of a monster's isolation. It was a shared silence, thick with the electric, rhythmic pulse of two souls who had finally found a friction that didn't burn, but forged. Tae-Ho stood behind Janice, his broad shoulders a solid anchor against the glass. He didn't reach out with the trembling, desperate hand that had once chased Seoul away. Instead, he leaned in, his fair complexion grazing her mahogany shoulder, his breath a low, steady vibration against her skin. He wasn't too much for her. He was the exact measure of her strength. They spend their lives looking for someone to handle them, Janice whispered, her neutral-toned lips curving into a regal smirk as she leaned back into his chest. But a king doesn't need a handler. He needs a mirror. Tae-Ho's arms wrapped around her hourglass silhouette, his hands locking over hers, the cold king and the warm disruptor finally speaking the same jagged, high-stakes language. This was the Devout lesson of the Underworld. Power is a lonely throne until you find the one person who isn't afraid to sit on it with you. The world had seen them as outcasts, one too intense, the other too bold. But together, they were a new empire, built on the wreckage of every normal expectation they had shattered in a single, transformative night. The story of the shattered alpha and his unflinching queen proves that you are never too much for the right person. You are simply a masterpiece waiting for someone with the vision to understand the art. If you've enjoyed this high-stakes journey into the heart of the Kwon Empire, don't let the story end here. Subscribe to stay updated on the next chapter of their reign and discover more cinematic narratives of power, passion, and regal romance. Like and comment below to let us know which moment of Tae-Ho and Janice's collision was your favorite. Share this story with those who know that being too much is exactly what it takes to change the world. One night was just the beginning. Join the Empire today. Thank you.